Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. Dogman versus a lake monster, Dogman versus a lizard man, Dogman versus the Rake, plus Dogman and the Black-Eyed Kids, and it all begins now.
Dogman meets Raystown Ray. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've watched your channel for a few years now because I like cryptid stories. Just last month, my fiancée we can call Susie and I both simultaneously had our first cryptid sighting, and amazingly, we saw 2 cryptids at one time. Back in May, Susie got a week off from her job, and I had free time as well, so we decided to get out into nature and camp for a week. Our friends were all interested in socializing since they hadn't done much of that for a year, but Susie and I ached to spend some nights out under the stars after being locked in our apartment for so long. Even though she didn't believe in any cryptids and she regarded me as childish for making this request, Suze agreed to camp out with me near Raystown Lake so that I could spend some time monster watching. Raystown Lake is located, as you would expect it to be, in one of those many north-south valleys in Pennsylvania, midway between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Those ridges and valleys are peak spots for weird experiences. It seems almost any place you go over there, you've got a decent chance to see not only Dogman and Bigfoot, but also UFOs, ghost lights, and even giant birds or pterodactyls. And the reason I chose Raystown Lake to go to is that it's known to have its own lake monster. I looked it up, and the story is that there's a huge sea serpent like the Loch Ness Monster living in the lake, and it comes out usually in April. It's rumored to be a vegan, so it won't eat tourists. There are a number of photos that purport to show Raystown Ray, as the creature's been dubbed. Granted, we were going in May, which is a little late in the Raystown Ray spotting season, but I felt lucky, and I wanted to see the first cryptid of my life. Susie had never heard of Raystown Ray, so she did her own research. Darned if she didn't locate a video on the Logan Gardner channel on YouTube, in which a man named Dwight Beal, the former operations manager of Lake Raystown, tells what he calls the truth behind the Raystown Lake monster. In this video, which you can watch for yourself, Mr. Beal says that years back, he was approached by someone from a local newspaper that wanted to do an April Fool's lake monster story. They asked Mr. Beal, in his capacity as operations manager of the lake, to play along and pretend to believe that there's a monster in the lake. He decided to go along with the gag and even convinced his staff biologist to risk his reputation and to state for the record that there is in fact a big sea serpent in Raystown Lake, and that it doesn't eat meat. This way families wouldn't be afraid to vacation on the lake, and hopefully it would attract curious people in the way it had attracted me. Now Raystown Ray has his own website with a merch store selling t-shirts and postcards. Susie laughed and said to me, "Dude, it's all just a tourist trap." That last comment was one I took offense to. I asked her how she didn't know that the video wasn't the real April Fool's prank. Maybe Mr. Beal was just joking when he said that the monster doesn't exist. Where did all the photos of it come from, if it isn't real? I asked Susie. I don't know, she answered. Maybe the graphics department of the tourism board? She kind of hurt my feelings, so I pouted. She found that incredibly funny for some reason, and told me that she wanted to go to Raystown Lake to camp, which I know she didn't really want to do. So the monster hunt was back on. One of the coolest things I noticed from looking at a map of the place is that the lake itself looks like a sea serpent from above. It twists and turns like a giant water snake slithering its way up the narrow valley in Pennsylvania. Of course there's a lake monster there. How could there not be? We considered staying at the Susquehanna campground, but once we arrived there, it seemed too civilized for me. I talked Susie into joining me scouting around for another more private place to stay, and if we couldn't find a better place to set up camp, I'd agree to go back to the official campsite. Well, it wasn't even an hour later that we found a perfect spot on a little triangular-shaped beach jutting out into the lake. We had trees surrounding us on 3 sides, and the lake out in front. It was the perfect spot. It was fantastic. We had the sunny beach. We had the shade of the trees 10 feet behind us. We had the water in front of us, and I had a great view for monster watching. Our first day there proved eventful, as 2 really tall, red-bearded bald men showed up and claimed that we were camping on their property. They were pretty intimidating, and we said we'd pull up our camp and go stay at the Susquehanna campground instead. The men asked us how long we were planning on being there, and we said 5 or 6 more days. They talked between themselves, then asked if we would be willing to pay $75 for the week. We offered to PayPal the money, but they said cash only. I think we had around $67 combined on us, which they took and departed, saying, "Have a fun week." An hour or 2 later, a couple in their 30s or 40s approached with 2 tween-age kids, asking if we knew that we were on private land. We said, well, yes, we did, but we already paid the owners to rent it for the week, and so everything was cool. "You paid the owners, did you?" asked the man. "I don't see how that's possible since my wife here and I are the owners." Their kids glared at us like we were criminals. "We paid these 2 big, bald, red-bearded guys," Susie insisted. The couple looked at each other knowingly. "You know who we mean, don't you?" asked Susie. In fact, they did, and they said it wasn't the first time those guys had pulled that scam. They decided to let us stay for free, but gave us their number and asked us to give them a ring if we saw those red-beard guys again. We agreed, and they left, but we never saw them or the 2 bald men again. Somehow, Susie was annoyed at me over all of this. It was the second night when things really got crazy. I had lost my phone in the lake earlier in the day, which was incredibly stupid of me. Susie had bought that phone for me and was unhappy with me for swimming out into the lake with it. I had read online that it was waterproof or something, and I wanted to test it. But a strong wave hit me, and I let loose of the camera. As soon as it slipped out of my hand, I lost sight of it, as the sun was beating down brightly on the surface of the lake. I tried to stick my head underwater to look for it, but managed to inhale water instead, and came up coughing and wheezing for most of the rest of the afternoon. I was feeling stupid, and Susie was getting cranky. First she had to give up all her cash, then I lost the phone she had bought for me. She was clearly having second thoughts about both this vacation and our engagement. It was not a happy moment in our lives. Susie went to sleep early in the tent, and I sat silently in the darkness on the beach. It was a beautiful night, but I couldn't enjoy it. I decided to start making plans in my head for what I would do if Susie dumped me once this vacation was over. A lot of times when I plan for the worst case scenario, I find it takes some of the stress out of my life. So, I was not just feeling small inside, I was projecting smallness out to the world. I was silent. I was unimportant. I was invisible. I saw a rodent of some kind walk right past me only about a foot away, just as though it knew I posed no threat to it whatsoever. If you've ever heard of someone wishing they could be a fly on the wall, well, I was even less noticeable than that. Cats will chase a fly on the wall, but even cats would have been bored with me that night. That was why I think I got to see the incredible things that happened next. Strolling into my view past the patch of trees to my left came a dripping wet, 6 or 7 foot tall, hairy, upright, canine-type humanoid. It had dog-like hind legs, but the torso and upper body of an extremely muscular man. It had a dog-type head with a long snout and a dog nose. Its pointed ears were on top of its head. Although I had not seen it walk out of the water, that's what it must have done on the other side of those trees, since it was soaking wet all over. The beast man was carrying 2 large fish with it, which it dropped to the sand, where they bounced and wriggled around. The dog man turned in my direction, and I scrunched myself down reflexively. It proceeded to shake itself around to dry off, staring past me and above me as it did so. I was pretty sure it hadn't noticed me, or else it didn't care. I wasn't sure if it saw our tent over by the trees, as that might have been hidden from its view also behind some foliage. I had always wanted to see something like what I was seeing, but I had always imagined being at a much safer distance than I was. If that dogman noticed me, it could be on top of me before I would even be able to stand up to run away. On top of that, I had been sitting in an uncomfortable position while I was moping and feeling sorry for myself, so one of my legs was kind of asleep. I stretched it out slowly and massaged it gently, trying to reboot my circulatory system since I now had a much larger problem than I had a little while earlier. I wished I had my phone with me, but then again, I still wish that even as I'm writing this, I may have saved up enough to afford a new one by the time you're reading this, but then again I may not have. I wished I could be snapping pics or taking video. That way, if the dogman ended my life, at least I might leave behind some evidence of how it happened. I turned and looked for the tent. From my vantage point, it looked like it was 7 miles away. The idea of getting up and trying to move back there before the dogman caught up to me would be ridiculous. I wouldn't stand a chance. Calling out to Susie to take a pic with her phone wouldn't work either. It would attract too much attention. About the only thing I could try would be to psychically signal to her, but she was so unhappy with me that I doubted she would be tuned in to my wavelength. From the beach came a loud splashing, as though the Titanic had just bubbled up to the surface of the water. I spun around and saw the exact thing that I had come there to see. A sea serpent in Raystown Lake. A dinosaur or lizard-like head, even larger than the dogman's head, had lifted dramatically up out of the water at the end of an incredibly long reptile or snake-like head. I don't really know if the entire thing was one long giant water snake or eel, or if it eventually attached to some sort of plesiosaur-like body under the waves, but that neck alone was longer than the dogman was tall. So if the dogman was 6 or 7 feet, that neck would have had to have been 10, 11, 12 feet, possibly even longer, since I could not see under the water in the dark night. The lake monster at first went straight for the fish on the beach, trying to grab them in its immense monster jaws. That thing looked like its mouth was large enough to bite off half your body in one snap. The teeth were even longer than the dogman's, and they looked like little saw-edged knives all in a row. I bet it had several replacements ready for each tooth, just like a shark does, as its teeth looked more like those of a shark than any other sea animal I've ever become aware of. Just before the big lake lizard could grab the fish, though, the dogman did a kind of a sideways block, slamming into that head in much the same way an American football player might stop the forward movement of a player on the opposing team. The dogman reacted to the serpent's head as one would react to an entire human being. The head was just so insanely large. I sat there, mesmerized, as the dogman snapped at the monster head, which withdrew to a height just out of the dogman's reach. The canine man leaped forward, grabbing onto the sea snake's scaly neck with one claw, and using his momentum to get close enough to try to slash open the seabound creature's throat. That was when I saw how nimble every single part of that sea snake was, as it could pull that part of its neck out of the way without pulling its entire body backward. This seemed like an impossible movement as I saw it in real time. All I can assume is that the body of the creature must have been holding onto something in a sturdy fashion somehow. It was anchored, in other words, but I could not see how from my angle. While the Dogman was trying and failing to slice open the lizard creature's exposed throat, the demon fish snapped at the Dogman's back. There came a moment when both creatures appeared to have hurt the other one. I heard the Dogman scream the way a dog might if it stepped into a bear trap, and that water creature sounded like a deep-voiced flipper on steroids. I don't know how else to describe it. I guess it sort of sounded like an elephant trumpeting, but with a much deeper tone to it. I was wondering if both creatures were about to finish each other off. With all the noise they were generating, and with their focus being squarely and exclusively on each other, it dawned on me that this would be a good time to run back to the tent and wake up little Susie. I stood up on those unsteady legs, one of which was still half asleep. I began rubbing it and taking a step or two forward as I could manage. A terrible racket erupted behind me on the beach, and I instinctively dropped back down to the sand in a defensive position. I know you're probably thinking that I'm an idiot for not continuing to run back to the tent, but you don't realize how intimidating it was to be that close to not one, but two large cryptids that could easily snuff out my life without even thinking twice about it. In the case of the lake monster, I'm not sure if fish even think at all. If you're wondering how the landlocked Dogman was able to hold his own against the much larger sea creature, you have to understand that his claws that extended from his hand-like paws were so long that it was just sick. It was like a row of giant, super-sharp fish hooks at the end of super-long, ape-like arms. And the dog was fighting over its food, so it was not messing around. It was a kill-or-be-killed situation, and that Dogman had no intention of losing the battle. I imagine that the sea creature had been competing for the same fish that the Dogman caught, but I also wondered if the Dogman might have stolen them from the lake monster somehow. One way or another, that water monster had to have seen the Dogman exiting the lake with the big fish in his possession. It was not a random attack. I think Raystown Ray had spied on and pursued the Dogman. Otherwise, how would he have known to lift up out of the water exactly where it had crashed up to the surface? Obviously, I can't be certain since all that had to have happened before I looked over there, but it kind of makes the most sense to me as to what must have happened, in the prequel, as it were. The battle was continuing and neither creature had noticed me so far, so I resumed my disjointed movement away from the beach and back toward the tent. When I got there, I was stunned to find that Susie had zipped herself inside the tent with me still outside. I whispered her name, but she did not respond. I reached under the tent to grab the zipper from the inside and began to work the zipper up. It wasn't going very well. A big splash came from the lake, and I looked over to see the great water beast flailing about, with the Dogman off the ground, hanging onto its throat. The Dogman was splashed into the lake, then onto the beach. It never loosened its grip on the lake monster's neck. Its claws must have been as strong as if they were made of steel to withstand the beating that the snake-like head and neck was giving them. I heard the sound of unzipping and was relieved to see the cranky face of my girlfriend glaring out at me. "What do you want?" that face asked me. "Your phone," I whispered. "No way," came her loud reply. "Not after what you did to your own." "Shh." I hushed her. "Come look," I whispered, gesturing that she should come outside. She looked at me the way that white dog looks at the Victrola in the old RCA ads from the 20th century, and so I pointed toward the beach emphatically with my eyes wide open. I was trying to get her to understand that this was more important than me losing my phone. Curiously, she leaned her head out of the tent and looked toward the beach. "What the blank?" she asked, having trouble taking in the complexity of what her eyes were seeing. Yes, there was a lake monster, but also, yes, there was a Dogman, and, yes, they were having a life and death battle. The sea snake succeeded in hurling the Dogman off its neck, and the large bipedal canine landed hard on the sand, back down and belly up. I could hear the wheeze of the wind being knocked out of the beast, and in that instant, the lake monster swallowed up both fish plus a whole lot of sand and slipped back into the water. "Your phone," I said more loudly. "Take a goddamn picture." Susie finally understood and withdrew into the tent to grab her cell phone. I looked toward the beach, and the Dogman, still trying to refill its lungs with air, was beginning to climb to his dog-like feet. Susie emerged from the tent, fiddling with her phone. "Ugh," she said. "Wait, it didn't open the app right. I have to turn it off and turn it back on again." As she said this, I watched the Dogman running down the beach to our right, chasing the lake monster, I would presume. Maybe it could see where the lake monster was swimming, something I could not see from my angle. "Here, give me the phone," I said, grabbing it from her hands and running down toward the beach. The phone was still rebooting itself. I was pretty sure she only needed to restart the app, not the whole phone, but there was nothing I could do about that. I ran down to the beach, still able to see the Dogman off in the distance. As the phone opened up again, I tapped the camera app, which eventually came on. The Dogman leaped into the water, swimming after the lake monster and those fishes it had stolen. It seemed to me that it would be a whole lot easier just to catch a new fish than to fight Ray's Town Ray again, but I think by that point it had become sort of a grudge match. I held the camera up and zoomed in as far as it could go, but there was nothing to see anymore by that point. I stayed there, standing, waiting, hoping that either of the creatures might double back and give me another chance at a photo, but it was not meant to be. When I got back to the tent, Susie was outside waiting for me. I figured I was about to get lectured for stealing her phone, but she was just happy that I hadn't lost or broken it. She was also apologetic for reacting too slowly when the monsters were battling right in front of us. That surprised me. She actually apologized, something that I wasn't aware that girlfriends ever did. She even gave me a little speech about how she knew how much it meant to me to get to see a cryptid, and how she felt kind of guilty that her bad mood ruined my chance to get a cryptid photo. "I should have been out there on the beach with you," she said, "not in the tent punishing you because you accidentally lost your cell phone and so forth." Somehow this weird situation had made her all romantic. I was not in the mood at all for that, but it was a lot better than getting lectured, so I tried my best to reciprocate and not let her notice that I was still shaking all over from the shock of everything that had just gone down. One of the nice things that came out of this is that Susie is now a lot more interested in what I'm interested in. She's more open to a lot of the stuff I care about, like Dogman and Bigfoot and aliens and all of that. I like her a lot more too. She seems so much cooler than she ever seemed before. The last time we visited her parents, she even wore her Ray's Town Ray Lake Monster t-shirt that she got from the Ray's Town Ray website. I feel like our relationship got a second chance thanks to the Dogman. But Susie and I do have one correction to add to the Ray's Town Ray mythology. If that monster was a vegan, then it never would have been fighting Dogman over those two big fish on the beach. No, Ray's Town Ray is clearly on a seafood diet. That's something my fiancé and I learned without a doubt on the night when we saw Dogman meets Ray's Town Ray. Dogman versus Lizard Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC. First of all, I want to say right off the bat that if you're in the camp that believes that Dogman is an animal like a bear or a wolf, and that eventually it will be known by science, then I don't think you'll like my story. If you've got a wider opened mind and you can take a story at face value, then what happened to me might open your eyes. That's because way back in 1989, I myself witnessed a UFO in Florida. Following that UFO in my 1979 Fiat Spider convertible, my girlfriend and I had our creepy encounter with both Dogman and what I can only presume was either a reptilian or lizard man. I'm pretty sure those things aren't normal natural Earth creatures, and I'll try to convince you of the same as I tell you about what happened to us. So, I was there with my girlfriend Dora, not her real name, and we were parked in the middle of nowhere by some palm trees watching the lizards run up and down them. Forests up north are inviting patches of natural wonder, but down in Florida, they're impenetrable and frightening patches of jungle instead. She wasn't finding our location very romantic and asked me to at least put up the roof so that she didn't feel so exposed. She told me that she was afraid one of the lizards were going to climb in, and the one thing in the world she was most creeped out by was lizards. I figured this lover's lane wasn't doing its job, so I pulled out of there and we cruised for a while, looking for another location that would be as private but less creepy. Dora leaned against my shoulder, smiling, glad to be out of the dark jungle. Soon, she seemed to have fallen asleep, but I just kept driving and looking for a better place to park. I remember we were up by Weston and I decided to drive north of there and see what I could find. I'm guessing we were on Route 27, because when I look at Google Maps, that's basically the way I remember the road looking, except it was dark and lonely, with nobody else around. I guess there's not much to drive to up there in the middle of the night. The road is just 2 lanes going one way and 2 going the other, but the interesting thing about Route 27 is that it's built upon a series of islands. What I mean is, it has a canal of water to the left of it and a canal of water to the right, with a big old patch of grass in between the 2 roads. Sometimes the water from the left side and the right side meet underneath and you go on a bridge over it. Like I said, a series of islands. If you use any images from Google Maps or Google Earth when you're showing this story, please make sure to tell your audience that this happened at night. In the daytime Google Maps images, it looks like a nice and sunny, fun place to be. That night we were there, I was starting to get creeped out, driving there with no lights except for the stars and my headlights. I had already begun looking out for a legal way to make a U-turn and head back south where it's far more civilized. That's when the lights came by for the first time, or at least that's when I noticed them. At first I thought I was seeing light reflecting off the inside of the passenger seat window past my sleeping girlfriend Dora. I was trying to steal glances in that direction while driving, but it was kind of hard. It seemed to me that there was something strange out there, lit up in the night sky, but it didn't move in any normal kind of way. It always seemed to move up and down as though it were on a flat surface, not in 3-dimensional space, if that makes any sense at all. I was thinking it can't be an object in space. It has to be a stationary lit-up object on my left, being reflected onto the glass, bumping up and down on the road to my right. But there was absolutely nothing to my left that was lit up at all. It was just land and trees and palm trees and water and grass and more land. I began looking inside the car to see if something were reflecting off the dashboard, but there wasn't any kind of light that looked anything like what I kept seeing, or at least what I kept thinking I was seeing, out the window to my right. Eventually, I woke Dora up and I asked her to look out there for me. She soon started making noises that kind of worried me. I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I knew they were not happy noises. "It's a tricky looky," she said, which was what her family called optical illusions. I asked her what the trick was, and she said she couldn't tell yet, but it couldn't be real. It was moving around like a squiggle, and it was moving too fast to be a helicopter or a plane. She started putting forth a theory that maybe it wasn't moving. Maybe it was because we were moving. And then her voice trailed off, and soon neither of us was saying anything at all. After about a minute of silence, I asked Dora for an updated report on the strange lights. This time she sounded dreamy. "It's beautiful," she told me in a dazed-sounding voice. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That was about all I could take, so since there was no traffic, I pulled the car to the right and parked. Grabbing my old mini binoculars out of the glove compartment, I stood outside the driver's seat door, leaning my chest against the car and studying the strange lights in the sky as best as I could. Whatever it was, either was able to alter its shape or else move so quickly as to leave colored trails behind it, providing the illusion of a constantly changing shape. It was often red, sometimes a yellowish white, and would produce small lights of greenish and bluish tones that would burst out of it and seemingly fade out. It looked like a living sparkler in the sky, a never-ending, intelligent firework. It truly was beautiful, but it was also hypnotic, and it was starting to do things that just seemed completely impossible. I don't even know how to describe it, just things that it shouldn't have been able to do. Feeling a growing sense of fear, I jumped back in the car, drove left across the grass to the highway on the other side, and started driving us back toward home. Now the weird light was on my side, and I struggled with all my focus and concentration not to look at it even peripherally. Dora was shouting out a play-by-play to my right, telling me what it was doing and how its appearance was continually changing. Eventually, she told me that it looked like it was landing. And for some reason, I felt a lot more frightened upon hearing that. I remember hitting the gas and speeding up, but I don't remember us getting very far before I had to slow the car down and stop, idling there, in the middle of the road, out there in the night, lit up by my headlights. In between us and home were two very strange and impossible creatures, both apparently outcasts from a Ray Harryhausen picture, taking up the entire road, with a battle straight out of ancient mythology. Now, before I describe this, I want to say that these events don't occur in a vacuum. This fight that I'm about to describe led to Dora becoming obsessed with all this David Icke stuff a few years afterward. I'm not going to diss you if that's your thing, but Dora went overboard, and she drowned in it. It's not exactly what led to our breakup later in the 90s, but it certainly didn't help anything. And this is all because she became convinced that what we were witnessing was a battle between a reptilian and some other hairy alien creature. I don't know if she's still going on about that stuff these days because we aren't in touch, and I deliberately quit social media back in 2017. I got sick of seeing how crazy people that I used to respect had become, Dora included. If I hadn't randomly chosen to drive north into an area I was unfamiliar with that night, Dora and I might have gotten married. We might be sitting together tonight, instead of me typing this story down for you. I think it's my only true regret in life, that I drove north that night, instead of turning around and driving the sleeping girl home. I was a young man, and I wanted her attention. I placed my own happiness first, and in that case, it led to us seeing this traumatic thing that scarred and changed both of us. The two man-things in front of us were larger than life. They were like Jack Kirby versions of a lizard man and a dog-headed man. They were so tall it was absurd. I don't mean Godzilla tall, but I do mean something like 13 or 14 feet tall. Dora's father told both of us that we saw two guys wearing Halloween costumes, and we had to laugh at him. These were twice the size of men, and it would have been impossible for a human to operate a puppet that large either. Imagine the exoskeleton in that aliens picture. That was the size of each of these creatures. I'm not trying to say they appeared mechanical or as though they were operated via hydraulics. They looked and moved like giant-sized living creatures. You could sort of say it looked like special effects monsters in real life, but even that is sort of not true, because this was so much more real. It was certainly a tricky looky of some sort. I know that something real was happening on the road in front of us, and yet I also feel positive that it wasn't exactly what we were thinking that we were seeing. I'm really not sure what I even mean by that, but both of the animals did little tiny things that made them seem impossible to me. Things that were just a little bit off, and I felt just a little bit as though my consciousness were not in the normal frequency. This might be the Oz effect that I've read about, but I don't know. I have a deep suspicion that there was more going on that night than we could view with our eyes or hear with our ears. Maybe I mean that there were more dimensions in that moment than the ones we're used to. You could tell that things weren't normal. You could feel it in every cell of your body. My hair stood on end, and it was both terrifying and exciting simultaneously. If I lived through this, I knew I was going to miss that intense feeling. And yet, it was so horrible to endure. I wanted it to stop the entire time. The one creature was in earth tones of browns and blacks with white teeth flashing as he snapped repeatedly, trying to bite a big chunk out of the reptile man. The hairy thing resembled a wolf more than anything else, although it stood up on two very massive hind legs the size of tree trunks. They looked like they could support a house, and the wolfman was able to maneuver quickly in battle on those mighty appendages. He, and I'm certain he was a male, had large hand-like paws at the end of its front legs or arms, and each of the fingers ended in a remarkably long talon, possibly even longer than its teeth. It did not use these paws or claws for attack, though, at least not in my presence. It would defend using its front legs or arms, but when attacking, it seemed monomaniacally only interested in snapping at the lizard, attempting to bite him. The hairy mammalian-looking monster's opponent had grayish, scaly skin. Dora says it was green skin, but if so, it was a dull and grayish green. It was roughly proportioned like a very tall man, but it was not human in any way. Rather than a wolf or canine head, this one had the head you would expect, the head that Jack Kirby would have drawn on him in a Marvel comic book. In fact, to compare this creature to the Lizard Man from Spider-Man comics would not be an outlandish thing to do. He wasn't wearing a torn white lab coat, but you get my point. Doris started screaming that they were aliens or something like that. She was saying they were from the UFO, but to be honest, I don't know for a fact that the lights we saw were from a UFO or a craft. They might have been some kind of a light show designed to hypnotize us to see those monsters fighting. After all, I don't really know if any or all of this really happened, in the normal sense of the term, happen. Doris is certain that she knows what happened, but even now, all these years later, I can only guess. If we did hallucinate what we saw, we both hallucinated the same thing. She and I both saw what looked like men with animal heads battling on the road a few minutes after we saw strange lights in the sky. I tend to agree with her that the lights must have probably had something to do with the Dogman and the Lizard Man, but I can't prove that, and the two might have been unrelated to each other, as unlikely as that seems to me personally. It was after some time of the two of us sitting there like couch potatoes watching my three sons when it dawned on me that we were both acting sort of strange. Why wasn't I driving away? Nothing was stopping me from making a U-turn. Then again, I'd only be heading back north then, and up north from there. There's a whole lot of scary nothing. I began to notice the rhythm of the battling. It was almost hypnotic in and of itself. The Dogman would make an advance, snapping at the throat of the Lizard Man, who would retreat and back up toward the other highway. Then, The lizard would begin swiping at the dog with his deadly-looking claws, and the dogman would leap backward, entirely blocking the road in front of us. Rather than allowing myself to continue to be lulled to sleep by the back-and-forth motion, I used it to focus my attention more strongly. When the two beasts charged to the right, I floored the gas, charging forward in their direction and causing Dora to let out a frightened squeal. I hadn't lost my mind, though, quite the opposite. I swerved left as the monsters charged right, and I drove across that grass divider toward the other side of the highway. Reaching the blacktop, I skidded to the right, knowing I was now heading in the direction of oncoming traffic. If I hadn't known it already, Dora screamed it loudly into my ear. I wasn't concerned about that, though. There was no traffic for as far as the eye could see. I only thought about one single thing. Am I going to get past these two monsters fighting to my right before they stumble and roll back in this direction and crush us? Well, sadly, the monsters landed on top of us and we perished on that night. Oh no, wait, we got through and lived to tell the tale. I got us both home safely, but neither of us was ever really the same person again that we had been before. Over the years, every time I think I've got everything figured out in life, I remember Dora thinking she had everything figured out about the two monsters and the strange lights in the night sky. To her, these were two warring alien species, battling it out on Earth like something from Star Trek or whatever. Her interpretation is 100% like something out of science fiction, if you ask me, but I'm not saying I know enough to prove her wrong. She thinks the lizard people are the real rulers of Earth, and I forget what she thinks the Dogmen are. She lectured me one night on how many different alien species are on Earth, and when she was done, I reminded her that she forgot to include Alf. Also, Gazoo from the Flintstones, can't forget him. Honestly, I'm not against the idea of aliens. I'm just against the idea of jumping to conclusions that something is alien when we really don't know. I am increasingly enamored of the concept that the lights were a device used to brainwash or hypnotize us, and that possibly the fight itself may have been another hypnosis device. After all, it had such a rhythmic nature to it. When I pulled past the monsters making our escape, Dora actually asked me why I did that. She had been content, sitting there staring dumbly at the monsters fighting. She had stopped questioning it entirely. When others stop questioning and start accepting, that makes alarm bells go off inside me and I start to get very suspicious. Could what happened to us have been an experiment of some kind? Could it have been carried out by either military or else private interests who were developing this strange technology, possibly for military uses? Could it have been a psyops experiment to see how people might react to it, so that it could be deployed against our country's enemies? Could it be that we haven't heard much more about this sort of thing happening again because our reactions weren't what they had hoped? After all, I figured out a way to get out of there. I escaped whatever hold they were trying to have over us, assuming that my idea is correct and that this was all somehow not exactly really happening. Dora and I both saw the same thing as each other, and yet we both have completely different ideas about what it was that we actually experienced. She and I tell completely different stories, but both versions have the same title, which is Dogman versus Lizardman. Dogman fighting the Rake. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that I don't even believe. My girlfriend, I think, caused this to happen, and even she doesn't believe me. I saw a battle to the finish between two creatures that are not even supposed to exist. This Slender Man-like, pale, thin Rake creature versus a North American upright walking canine, aka the Pennsylvania Dogman. Let's call my girlfriend Samantha, because she fancies herself a witch. I wanted to go camping, but she only agreed if we could camp in or near a haunted spot. I really was not into that. It seems like asking for trouble. I, for the most part, don't believe in magic or superstitions, but I also don't believe in tempting fate. Like, I don't think walking under a ladder brings bad luck, but if I notice a ladder, I will avoid walking under it just in case, you know? But she's my girlfriend, and it meant camping alone with her, so I was willing to accept any conditions she set up. We live together now, but back then when this happened, it was hard for us to find alone time. We borrowed my cousin's old Toyota for the weekend and drove out to Samantha's choice location, Egg Hill. You see, Egg Hill Church is the location of a supposed massacre where a priest did his entire congregation in, one by one, like in a Michael Myers movie. We found a nice spot near there, a bit south by Sinking Creek, so that we'd have a natural source of water. Samantha insisted that running water made magic happen better because of this or that pseudo-scientific reason that made no sense to me. I just don't like being thirsty. That's the magic of clean running water to me. So after dinner, Samantha did this really dumb thing that she got me involved with too. We sat by the fire and used this old Ouija board, right? And she called for all malevolent spirits to make themselves known. Why would somebody do something like that? Clearly, to me, she sees life as some sort of game. Either that, or she doesn't know what the word malevolent means. Don't ask for evil to show up in your life. It does that often enough, even if you avoid inviting it in. At any rate, the evil didn't come looking for her. It came looking for me. I needed to pee, but also the two of us had started bickering and arguing over the Ouija board, and I just wanted a break from the fighting. I walked into the tree line, and then I kept walking for a while. I needed some emotional space from Samantha, and somehow creating more physical space between us helped me feel a little better. I was deep into my self-pity when I finally finished relieving myself and noticed a commotion happening deeper into the forest. Turning around first to make sure I knew the way back to camp, I then ventured a bit further into the darkness until I saw them. I was able to hide behind a crooked tree and get a pretty good view of them without them seeing me. It was a battle between a Rake, which is something I had read about in creepypasta but didn't think was real, and some kind of wolfman or dogman. The ears and face did resemble some kind of wolf or prehistoric dog, but the body was in some ways creepily almost human. Although the hind legs were lupine or wolf-like, it used them to stand upright like a human, not like a dog. The front legs appeared to have evolved into a longer, deadlier version of human arms, with fingernails like daggers. If the dogman's claws were as long as daggers, the Rake's claws were swords in comparison. While the dogman had large paws that were very nearly hand-like and looked as though they could be used to handle tools, the Rake's long fingernail weapons were so absurdly, nightmarishly long that they made the hands basically useless for doing anything but viciously destroying any form of life in its vicinity that seemed edible. I knew that from the creepypastas that I had read. The Rake feeds off of scaring humans, true, but he also devours any life form he's able to defeat and slice apart with those nightmare fingers. I think the Rake saw the Dogman as food, and I think the Dogman saw the Rake as one of his only true enemies. I don't think he wanted him destroyed so that he could eat him. I think the Dogman wanted the Rake destroyed for his own safety. I watched as the pale, almost glowing monstrosity charged forward toward the Dogman, and I saw the Dogman retreat, screaming, swatting the super long fingernails away, and not coming out of it unharmed. The Dogman would be down on all fours when attacking, but would stand up on his hind legs when in retreat, so that he could use his arms to bat off the Rake's advancing attack. I think I gasped at one exchange between the two, and the Rake stopped his attack on the Dogman, and in one lightning quick movement, turned his head to stare directly at me. He had been a flurry of activity moving so amazingly fast that the eye could not follow, but once it heard my presence, it locked its large, glowing orbs onto me and froze so still he looked like a wax figure. It was all I could do to not run away, but I sensed that this thing could move quickly, even if it looked so ill-proportioned and bizarre. I've read creepypasta about this kind of a creature on its hind legs, and I've read about them being quadrupedal. This one so far had stayed down on all fours. Once that Rake saw me, his attention was captivated. It was unmistakable and terrifying at the time. I didn't know why, but after researching the Rake on the internet since this happened, I do now have a theory. Whereas the Dogman only represented something to eat, I, as a human being, represented something to drive insane and torture to death, and then eat. He just lost interest in that Dogman and began to walk in my direction. His canine opponent was having none of that, however, and I watched as the Dogman tore his long claws all the way down the side of the blindingly white, dead-looking creature. The slicing move would have been enough to leave me on the ground, my life bleeding out all around me. The Rake reacted in discomfort briefly, but there was no blood coming out of those wounds. The only thing the Dogman had succeeded in doing was getting that nasty old Rake to forget about me again and to focus entirely on the Dogman. The next part happened so fast that it was almost hard to see. The pale killing machine sliced his opponent up so badly that I literally cannot describe it on this channel. The once terrifying and proud canine cryptid was done in swiftly, cruelly, unemotionally, and methodically. And once the one was sliced into many, the Rake made haste, beginning to devour what he had created. I ran back to camp, wondering how long it takes a Rake to eat a Dogman. Whatever the answer was, that was also the answer to the amount of time that Sam and I had to get out of there. When I reached our tent, I began packing smaller items up quickly, and I threw sand on the fire that Samantha was still sitting by. She asked me what was going on, and I think I just said something like, "Humor me and run to the car as fast as you can go." Fortunately, she did, because when I eventually told her what we were running from, she did not believe me. She still doesn't believe me, but I'm telling her and you the truth. I don't expect you to believe me either. Rakes and werewolves don't exist. Therefore, I couldn't possibly be telling the truth about the time I saw Dogman fighting the Rake. The BEK and the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you a story about a night I experienced that was like a Halloween night from a horror movie. I don't mean that it happened on October 31st. It was actually a cold night in late November or early December. That night was the only time I've ever seen a Dogman, and the circumstances under which it happened aren't really like any other Dogman story I've ever heard anyone else tell. And it didn't start off like it was a Dogman story at all. I was having a dream that someone was ringing my doorbell in the middle of the night. I felt a sense of dread about looking to see who it was, since I never expect visitors so late. When I looked out the windows, I couldn't see anyone there. In the dream, I turned around to go back to bed, but then the doorbell rang again and again. Eventually, it woke me up because it was the actual doorbell to my house ringing some time after midnight. Just as in the dream, I was afraid to answer the door, but unlike in the dream, I brought my Cecil Cooper model baseball bat with me as I walked nervously down the stairs. I had never been scared to answer my front door before, and I found it made me see everything in an entirely new light. My senses were far more alert, for one thing. I noticed that if I stood on one particular step in the middle of the stairwell and looked into the hallway mirror, I could see a reflection from the mirror in the front lobby of one of the windows looking out onto the area in front of the front door. So I could see a reflection of... No, not the Dogman, but two young teenagers, or tweens maybe. I thought they were both boys, but I was not getting a clear view of their entire faces. Rather than make me feel less frightened, this made me feel more. The houses on my block were and are spaced far enough apart with trees and nature in between that they feel sort of private, but we aren't isolated. There are 5 other families living on this block alone, so why had these two been ringing my bell, and my bell alone, for such a long period of time? I didn't like it. There was something odd or off about it. I studied them through the window, dressed so oddly. The one looked like he was a newsboy from the 1800s, including a little old-fashioned cap like I'd only seen in old movies before. The other one had a little Lord Fauntleroy look about him, wearing a white frilled collar from out of medieval times. What Halloween party had they come from? I stood there watching just a second too long because suddenly it seemed they had noticed me there. "Hey, mister," the one with the hat shouted. "Hey, mister, it's an emergency. We need to call our mother." I felt guilty. They just needed to call their mother. They were so underdressed for such a cold night. They must have been freezing. Maybe they were too cold to run to the next house to try their bell. My mind started making excuses for them out of guilt, trying to rearrange the facts so that I should do as they asked me to do. I walked over to the front door with every intention of letting them in. Heck, I was going to bring them in to warm them up. I marched over quickly, and then, at the last second before reaching for the doorknob, I glanced out the window at the little Lord Fauntleroy one. He didn't appear to be cold. I mean, his body posture was not one of a shivering person. A voice inside me told me to not open that door, but I had to. There were cold children outside. I opened the inside door, but kept the outer screen door locked. The boy in the hat didn't seem all that uncomfortable in the cold weather either. Both of them looked down, like they were depressed or something. The one with the hat spoke forcefully and rudely to me before I could say anything. "You have to invite us inside, mister," he said. "We have to call our mother." I decided to change the subject. "Aren't you cold?" I asked. And as I did so, I could see my breath in front of my mouth. That's how cold the air was. I hadn't seen that smoky effect when the kid spoke, though. I looked at the one with the hat, standing there, his brim hiding his eyes, and I asked him again, "Aren't you cold, son?" Unexpectedly, the other kid, the little Lord Medieval Times theater guy, barked out at me. "He said you have to invite us inside!" In this voice way deeper than I had been expecting. He looked up at me with hate on his face, and I saw his eyes, clearly, for the first time. He had no whites to his eyes. They were solid black like ink or oil, just shiny, wet blackness like a void, a negation of reality. I looked at the newsboy kid, and he looked up at me with angry black eyes as well. "I told you already, mister. We have to call our mother on your phone." And when I heard that voice, when I saw that face speaking that voice, I could tell this was not what it appeared to be. This was not a lost kid. I slammed the door in horror. Those were not children. They couldn't be. The two small people wailed outside my front door, demanding that I let them in. They screamed so loudly that I half expected my neighbors to come over asking what their trouble was. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have minded some company. I went upstairs and pulled the covers up over my head, too scared to look outside anymore. At length, the wailing stopped and the black-eyed kids apparently moved on. I didn't hear them walk away, but I didn't hear them outside anymore either. I wanted to go back to sleep, but I couldn't calm down. Something told me to go downstairs and take one more look around outside the house. There was nothing and nobody out front or down the left side of the house. When I got to the back, however, eyeshine immediately caught my notice. Staring intently, I could swear I saw the outline of the figure with the eyeshine, and that figure had to be 8 feet tall, with pointed ears up on top of its head, and that was not a human. For some reason, once the black-eyed kids left, I next found myself haunted by the Dogman. I knew this had something to do with the black-eyed creatures that had been at the front door. Either these were all demonic entities, or they were all from outer space, or something. Somehow they were part of the same world or reality as each other, if that makes sense. Our world was being invaded by their world, or their world was taking over. Another possibility is that these things come from underground. Maybe they exist in the same physical sense as you and me, but they just live deep underneath us. I'm not really sure exactly what I'm saying, but I am trying to say it very passionately. You don't just get a visit from strange kids with space alien eyes, and then get stalked by a tall, furry man with a wolf head, both in the same night. That wasn't random. The one had something to do with the other, even if I cannot now, nor ever will be able to tell you exactly how those two were both part of the same thing. I discovered that I could get the best view of the dog-headed man from the kitchen on the ground floor, so I stood there staring at it for a while. It really was hard to make out much besides the eyes and the overall body shape, which was like a professional wrestler with dog's legs. I remembered that my camera with a decent zoom on it was in the next room, so I went and got it, then came back to the kitchen. I pointed the camera at the Dogman, but before I could even look at it through the camera lens, the beast burst out of the tree line he had been standing in and came running directly toward me. I accidentally flipped the camera into the air as I screeched and ran out into the next room to run upstairs like the little chicken that I am. Even from upstairs, I could hear the Dogman banging on the wall of my house downstairs. I was convinced that he was going to get in and make mincemeat out of me. I picked up the phone and dropped it 3 times before I was finally able to call 911. I got my info out, and the guy on the line told me to stay on the phone with him until the cops arrived. And then the call got dropped. I heard the Dogman downstairs making a sound that was not unlike a howl, but also not unlike a very sad-sounding moan. He was walking around the house now, banging randomly on the walls. He seemed to be walking counterclockwise, moaning and banging. And then the doorbell rang and I went through the roof. I listened and I couldn't hear the Dogman anymore. It must be the little people with the black eyes. Now they were back to torment me more. How long was it going to take for the police to arrive? The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. I was so tired, and I was so sick of being scared. I grabbed my baseball bat and opened my window, leaning out and ready to throw my bat at the 2 annoying space alien-eyed cretins. Only it wasn't them. It was the cops. They had driven up with their sirens off because my neighborhood pays most of the taxes for this part of the state. I had never heard them arrive. The cops told me everything was ship-shape and no prowlers were on my property. I thanked them profusely and they left, telling me to get some sleep. I did not. Not until the sun came up anyway. I do not know why those black-eyed creatures or the Dogman came on that night. Unfortunately for my health, they have never come back, at least so far. I cannot explain anything about the presence or behavior of either of these entities, and I will never even begin to fathom the truth behind the Black-Eyed Kids and the Dogman. We'd like to thank this episode's executive producer, Ron Barracuda. His name is Barracuda. More hits than Lucas Duda. He's wiser than a Buddha. His name is Barracuda. Please join me in thanking Ron Barracuda for making this episode possible. Now here's PQ Ripper to explain how you can become a Scary Stories executive producer too. Take it, PQ. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.